Welcome back to Snack Chats with TLB. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Anna, and I'm so excited that we're going to get to talk about this today.
Oh, me too. So, if you haven't already watched it yet, Anna and I also did a intuitive eating kind of 101 video. So, just scratch the surface of what intuitive eating is. And today we wanted to kind of go through the 10 principles of intuitive eating and really explore the nuances with the principles. I think something we talk to clients a lot about is that these aren't like rules or anything like that. Like this really is such a guide to just support the journey. And so, yeah, we're going to go through that today. And if anyone has any questions, definitely comment below and we're happy to expand upon anything. But Anna, why don't you kick us off with principle number one?
I would love to. And you might see me kind of looking over at my screen every once in a while. I've just got some notes for myself. But basically, principle one is reject diet culture. And so this is kind of like a lofty principle number one, right? But essentially, like the intention is to get people started in recognizing like what even is diet culture, right? Like what does it mean to live in a diet culture and like exist under frameworks that really have us geared towards like changing our bodies and towards, like eating in really specific ways that don't always like match up with like what our bodies need. So that doesn't mean that a person isn't allowed to follow a specific type of diet, right? So like if a person has an allergy or like a chronic illness that would require them to follow a specific diet, that doesn't mean that like they have to reject any prospect of a diet, but more so, are you rejecting like the overall culture that tells us that like there's only one right way to eat or one right way to like exist in a body or with food? So that's normally kind of how I start talking about that principle. Is there anything else that you add for people, Sarah?
No, not necessarily. And I feel like that is such a good point in and of itself, where it's like, everyone has different dietary needs, and so there is no one size fits all, right? Like even with like intuitive eating, it's like there isn't just one way to interpret the intuitive eating principles. It's like, how can we apply this in a way that feels really accessible and really sustainable to each individual person? And I think that just really, what you just said really captures that, where it's like, yeah, there's going to be so many different dietary needs that other individuals can have, and that's okay. We can still explore it from all these different lenses.
Totally. Yeah. Well, do you want to tell us a little bit about principle number two?
Yes. So, principle number two is honor your hunger. And the idea behind this principle is that when our body is communicating to us that we feel hungry, we need food, and it's a positive and supportive thing to honor that by eating. Now, I think there's nuance with this, as with anything else, where you may not experience hunger cues necessarily, or hunger cues don't feel very reliable. And that could be due to so many different factors. That could be due to medications, that could be due to various chronic illnesses or neurodivergence. And so, yeah, I just want to point out that there is nuance to this, and honoring your hunger might not just mean, oh, my stomach is growling and therefore I need to eat. It might also mean honoring logical hunger. And Anna, I know you did a video on logical versus biological hunger. So that could be a really great video to reference in regards to this. But yeah, that might mean creating structure for yourself so that your body is getting nourished on a consistent basis, even if there isn't very clear signs of physical hunger.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. I think you basically like hit the head. It's funny. I was also going to mention like that Marcy and I did a video on like physical and logical hunger. And so when I think about honoring hunger, yes, a lot of times it can look like, oh, like what's my body telling me? And how do I honor what my body is telling me? But like, that, first of all, is not always accessible to people, right? Like some people have like jobs that don't allow them to eat when they're hungry, right? Like they have like really like explicit like lunch breaks, right? So it's also just kind of, can we honor like to the best of our abilities, eating in a way that will try to like meet our body's needs throughout the day, given what our work situation looks like, given what our like financial situation looks like as it relates to like accessing these foods that would like honor our hunger. Yeah, I think honoring hunger doesn't necessarily just look like, oh, stomach's growling and I'm having a craving. Like, what do I eat? Right? Like, it can be a little bit more like structured and take into account a person's like access to food.
Absolutely. Yeah, and even with honoring hunger, if there are cues, I think there's also a lot of learning to be done around body cues because I think going back to diet culture, so often we're taught to eat based on external, right? Like eat
Yeah.
at this time, eat these kind of foods versus really relying on our internal cues. And so again, going back to that hunger and fullness, logical hunger video, I think that could be so helpful because there might be kind of earlier signs of hunger that we might not even be picking up on because we're encouraged
Totally.
in a lot of cases. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think there's a lot to learn within this principle and a lot to explore.
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome. Yeah. Okay. How about principle number 3?
Yeah. So principle number three is make peace with food. And I think, coming back to diet culture, it is really common in diet culture to kind of take a really black and white approach to food. So it's this idea of like, there are foods that are objectively good for me, and there are foods that are objectively bad for me. And I think a lot of people have like their own individual lists, but I'm going to be talking in kind of like generalized, maybe like stereotypical terms here, where like a lot of times when we're thinking about like the good foods, it's going to be things like maybe, vegetables, not even all fruits. I think sometimes there can be a little bit of like beliefs about like sugar in fruit, right? Or like things like that. Um, whole foods, whatever that means to a person, that kind of thing, might be in like the stereotypically like good category. And then in the stereotypically bad category, a lot of times we'll see things like maybe more so like desserts or things that people view as like a treat or like something that you might like enjoy, but maybe people believe doesn't have any sort of like nutritional value, right? It's like so funny because I'm like, there's so much to unpack in like each of the terms that I'm using. But that basically, like, when I think about like making peace with food, I think a lot of times like the perspective would be like, well, you're making peace with like the quote unquote like bad foods because, like, of course, you don't have a peaceful relationship with those. Like, you don't really let yourself have them, or like whether you let yourself have them is really conditional, which I think is really true. But then on the other side, it's like, I think people a lot of times don't realize like, you also don't really have a peaceful relationship with your quote unquote like good foods because a lot of times they become a little bit of like a means to an end, or like if I check this many good foods on my list, then I'm allowed to have like X amount of quote unquote bad foods, right? Like that kind of thing where it's like um to neutralize your relationship with all food means that like foods that were previously in your like good category, you do actually get to like really enjoy because you're not treating them just as like a means to an end to like earn the quote unquote bad foods or like earn a certain like feeling, right? So that's kind of what I think about when making peace with food is like, how do we neutralize your relationship with all foods through probably some amount of like nutrition education, but then also through like talking through like what are some of like the belief systems that like come with these foods, right? Related to like diet culture. So that's kind of like what I think about when I think about like making peace with food.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, for our neurodivergent folks, I think about how there might be foods that feel really safe from a sensory standpoint, but then are getting demonized in our culture for
Totally.
various reasons, right? Or being labeled as good versus bad. And that can feel so confusing when somebody else might be like, but that's the food I feel really safe eating. And so
Totally.
yeah, I think this is such an important principle to explore from both ends.
Yeah, totally. And yeah, I think like the last thing I'll add with that is that like when we make peace with foods and like not labeling them as like good or bad, it does kind of like allow us to see like, oh, what do I get from each of these foods, right? Which is like, um, yeah, just like the goal with food, I think, is to be like, yeah, like what is this giving to me? Which I think is, yeah, just like a really helpful aspect of like making peace with food.
Yeah. Definitely. And I feel like that segues us very nicely into the next principle, which is discover the satisfaction factor, right? And the idea behind this is that we derive pleasure from food, from eating, from the eating experience, or we can. And foods, it's okay to enjoy foods and to enjoy different flavors and textures and temperatures and all of that. And, I think certain different ingredients bring out different flavors in food, right? And in addition to like the taste, flavor aspect of food, I think it's also the experience,
Yeah.
right? And deriving satisfaction from maybe going out to eat with friends or getting dessert with your partner or whatever it is where celebrating different celebrations that involve food and cultural traditions and so many different things that are centered around food and being able to just enjoy that and experience it in a very positive way versus feeling really afraid or feeling like, oh, well, I'm not supposed to be eating this food and this is bad and all of that. So, yeah, I think it can satisfaction can be the food itself, but then also the experience. I do want to point out that not everyone necessarily enjoys eating or derives pleasure from eating, right? It is okay if eating feels like a chore, even though it is a necessity for life. Not everyone, I don't think this is accessible to everyone necessarily. I think sometimes the goal is just how can we make eating or the experience of eating feel as safe as possible? Even if
Totally.
it's not enjoyable and pleasurable, does it feel safe? And do you feel grounded in this experience?
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree with you. I feel like that's a really good point. And a lot of times I do think about even framing that as satisfaction, right? Where it's like I feel satisfied with the way that I engage with food because it feels really safe for me. And like that in and of itself, right? Like the satisfaction factor can mean a different thing to like different people. And it
Mhm.
doesn't have to be, once again, it comes back to like this idea of like nothing is one size fits all. And so, yeah, just like the importance of like not projecting onto someone like to be satisfied by food means that like like you enjoy food on like this outing. It might be like to be satisfied with food is that like you don't have to put a lot of thought into it and you are in like a routine that at least meets like your biological needs, right?
Yeah, totally. That's such a good point, right? For providers, it's like we don't have to project what we think satisfaction is, which is also going to differ from each individual. It's like, what does satisfaction with food mean to the person sitting in front of us or the individuals that we're working with?
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, are we ready to talk about principle 5, feel your fullness?
Yes.
Okay.
Take it away.
Yeah, so feel your fullness. I think the intention behind that principle is about like giving your body the opportunity to like genuinely feel full after a meal, right? So I think a lot of the folks that we work with a lot of times like might eat to the point where it's like, oh, okay, well, I honored my hunger in that I'm like no longer hungry. And that like that doesn't actually bring us into like the fullness realm at all times. Fullness can be tricky because a lot of different things can get in the way of feeling fullness. And so to me, a lot of times I like to think about the fact that it's like so many different factors might impact whether or not a person feels full or at what point in a meal they might feel full. And so true attunement to fullness isn't always like, and I know exactly when I'm done, and I, always take the exact number of bites that gets me to this like perfect sensation of fullness. I think to me, it's just kind of figuring out like, with the help of like logical hunger, physical hunger, etc. Can we get you to a point at a meal where it's like I've eaten an appropriate amount of food and I'm not necessarily like still thinking about food or still craving food or having these like other signals of lack of fullness that like have not been met yet, right? So like feeling fullness means not just like your stomach expanding, but also like feeling ready to like walk away from a meal and not being like, well, like could I have taken a few more bites or could I have not taken a few more bites, right? Like that's kind of what I think about when I think about like feeling fullness.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And a lot of times I talk about it from the standpoint of just like having trust, right? Because I think a lot of times as we're introducing this concept, I find that clients feel really afraid. Like, what if I just don't stop eating? What if I just keep going and I never feel fullness? And that's not necessarily going to be the case. And just being able to trust that the body is going to provide that communication, or we're going to work through skills to determine, well, what are your body's needs, and what does fullness look like for you and your body? And then that just takes a little trial and error and practice, I think.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think trial and error is really important for all of these principles, but
Mhm.
specifically with feeling fullness, because a lot of times, what we might find is that someone is like, yes, like I got to the end of the meal and I genuinely felt full, right? And then we might hear from them, but then like 30 minutes later, I was like thinking about food, or for some reason my stomach was growling. So much of this is also like, okay, like what was actually at that meal? What could we add to it to make it actually like last you a little bit longer, where it's like the feeling of fullness might be a little bit different in the moment, but like the length of fullness changes, right? So I think trial and error is a really good way of phrasing that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely. It's all trial and error. And I always tell clients too, like, it's okay to feel like, oh, I like overshot that or undershot that or whatever. It's like, great, we're gathering data on your body, right? Like, this was a learning opportunity. Now we get to use it for the next meal or the next eating
totally.
experience.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I feel like I could go on and on about this. One
Yeah.
last thing I'll say about it though is like this idea of also, you know, there's no like arrival point with like intuitive eating where it's like, and now I'm a perfect intuitive eater, or like I know exactly how to eat intuitively. And that even when someone has been like practicing intuitive eating for years, has like really built up like a lot of like attunement to this kind of thing, it's not uncommon to be like, oh, dang, like I overshot it, I undershot it, right? Because like bodies are weird, they change. And it's all about like, once again, coming back to like this idea of like, and when that happens, how do I show up for my body, right? Like, can I do it with like compassion? Can I try to get its needs met, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. But I
Sweet.
agree. We talk about it all day long. So
Easy.
instead, we'll
Yeah.
transition to the next principle, which is challenge the food police. And, I kind of interpret this principle as just understanding food rules, right? Whether that's like food labeling is good versus bad, or, yeah, any sort of rule that might come up around food or eating, timing of meals, things like that. And understanding where do those food rules come from. And I think for a lot of clients, the like food police might actually be the voice of, a parent or a caregiver or somebody from school, or just like diet culture as a whole that's kind of like, oh, shouldn't eat that, or you better do this, you have to eat this before you eat that, right? Like just these kind of arbitrary rules. And I just love exploring this with clients because I'm like, ooh, that sounds like a food rule, tell me more about that. And so often it's like, I don't even know why I follow that rule, or like, I don't know. That just feels like it's fact. So yeah, I'm curious how you explore that with clients, Anna.
Yeah, I mean, really similarly, I think to me it's funny because like I know this principle is challenge the food police, and a lot of times for me it's more so even like, can we just start by like getting to know the food police? Like it's like what are the rules, like you said, where did they come from? And it's remarkable how often um we like learn about a food rule where it's like, I actually don't even know where that came from. It just feels really present and really like emotionally like salient, right? And so, yeah, kind of like getting to know the food police and then like challenging it by like fact checking or by even just like changing behaviors and seeing like what happens when you do eat these foods that like you have like the rules around when we're kind of taking away some of like the judgment that might have been coming from like the food police, right? Like, does it actually not feel good for your body? Or do we find that like actually like that was really satisfying and really great? And like those experiences can change over time, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes. Definitely. Yeah. And it's finding out like what actually feels in alignment with your beliefs and values as an individual versus maybe the beliefs and values you grew up with or have just been surrounded by.
Totally. Yeah. Sweet.
Awesome. Yeah. The next principle, so we're at principle number 7, is cope with your emotions with kindness. I feel like there's so much nuance with this principle for sure. So we'll do our best to kind of explore some of it. Um, Ultimately, the way we talk about it, I think a lot of times in TLB as a whole is just what's in your coping toolbox, right? Like viewing our coping skills as tools in a toolbox, right? And just like we don't need just a hammer for every single project that we might be working on, food isn't always necessarily the only coping skill we want to have in our toolbox because it might not always be accessible or supportive given the circumstance we're kind of in, right? We need lots of different tools. And so, I think with this principle, a lot of times we're exploring with clients like what are other ways to maybe navigate the chaos or the uncertainty, the anxiety, those difficult emotions. What are some other ways to navigate those? What's going to feel really accessible to you?
Yeah.
And sometimes food is a necessary coping skill. It's accessible in some cases, and it is very comforting sometimes. And that's okay. There's no shame in that as well. Right. And so it's just, do we have options to explore based on what's feeling accessible in that moment?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really good way of phrasing all of that. Something I also like to add, even when we're talking about food as a coping, like as a form of coping, is also starting to learn when am I using food to help me soothe so that I can be with an emotion or so that I can be with an experience versus are there times that I'm using it to numb and take me completely out of an experience, which again is a form of using that tool, right? But can we start to distinguish a little bit of like, are there times where I'm using it in one way, or do I normally use it to completely take myself out of an experience? And that I think a lot of times when we're talking about using food to cope or using food to soothe, we think about when someone is eating for
Yes.
emotional coping, where it's like to use food to soothe is also when people are like choosing not to eat, right? Or like abstaining from food. And it's like that is actually still you using food as a coping, like as a form of coping. And so, once again, do we have other tools in the toolbox that we can be using so that the thing that we turn to is not always I either eat to cope or I restrict myself from eating to cope.
Mhm.
And so that you have access to other tools at those times is something that I think about.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love that. That's such a good differentiation.
Yeah, sweet. Well, anything else we want to talk about before I get into respect your body?
No, yeah, I think we covered it. But again, if anyone has questions, definitely leave them below. We'd love to explore the nuances of all of this. So I'm sure there are so many other scenarios that will come up where it's like, well, what about in this
Totally.
case? So we can definitely expand upon all of these principles.
I know it's so funny. It's one of those things where it's hard to even say anything definitively about these principles because I can think of so many scenarios where I'm talking with a client and it's like, yeah, like in this situation, it also really makes sense based on like your life and your experiences. And I think that is why it's important to remember that this is an overview and not a replacement for like working with a provider, right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. Well, principle number 8 is respect your body. I love talking about this principle, and I talk about body respect a lot with clients because I think as it relates to body image right now and kind of how we talk about it culturally, there's a lot of this thing of like, how do you feel towards your body, which is like, do you like your body? Do you not like your body? Do you feel neutral towards your body? Do you feel a combination of those things? And I like the principle of body respect or respecting your body because it comes back to this thing of irrespective of how you feel towards your body, whether you're feeling a type of way towards it because of how it looks, or whether you're feeling a type of way towards it because of it's maybe like what it can physically do for you, what it physically can't really do for you. Irrespective of all of those things, can we still treat your body with respect? Are we still looking to get its needs met to the best of our abilities, understanding that a lot of things in our culture get in the way of meeting our needs? But, to the best of our ability, are we trying to give it enough sleep? Are we trying to give it enough water? Are we trying to give it enough food? Um, are we trying to give it rest, and not just recovery, right? I think a lot about like the difference between like rest and recovery, where it's like it can look really similar, but your body needs rest in addition to like recovering from something that expended a lot of energy. So, yeah, I love body respect as a principle because it doesn't take away the fact that it's like, yes, the way we feel towards our bodies is important.
Mhm.
And irrespective of how we feel towards our bodies, do we or do we not show it respect, you know?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I feel like that really encapsulated that principle so well, yeah, I really have nothing to add. So,
Great. Well, the next principle is principle 9, and the name of the principle is movement, feel the difference. Movement is tricky. Um, in general, just because there are so many reasons that a person might engage in movement, right? Like there are some people who movement is part of their labor, right? It's like what they have to do in order to like earn money. There are some people who engage in, or there are some people who don't really have access to engaging in movement based on either like their built environment or, um, you know, differing abilities, et cetera, that kind of thing. And so, I think our work with movement a lot of times is there are a lot of benefits that a person can get from moving in a way that is accessible and sustainable for their bodies. And so it's figuring out what are those forms of movement for a person, right? Like movement doesn't always have to look like, I think there are really like generalized guidelines for people a lot of times, like everyone should be getting 30 minutes over 5 days of cardio or like whatever it might be, where it's like when we're kind of like getting rid of some of these structures that tell us like this is how you should be moving your body, that might not really make sense for a lot of people. What is a way of moving your body that feels good for you, both from like an emotional standpoint and a physical standpoint? And can we look at movement for like the benefits that you can get from it? Um, when you're like nourished and when you're taking care of yourself and showing your body respect that have less to do with, I think a lot of times people think movement and they think like weight loss potentially, right? And it's like there's so many reasons to engage in movement that have nothing to do with any like aesthetic change that might happen in your body.
absolutely. Yeah, and I
Yeah.
think so hard is that I think in our culture, so often movement is associated with like an aesthetic change that we don't even talk about. Like you mentioned, like all these other benefits, just with like mobility and strength and so many other things that are beneficial that come along with movement, because our culture focuses so much on like, oh, if I move this way, this is going to happen to my body, when that's
Totally.
not necessarily the case, and that's okay.
Yeah, I also talk a lot about how it's like, um, it seems like a pretty recent, and when I say recent, maybe like in the last like 20 to 40 years or something like that, that movement became this thing of like, I put on my special little movement outfit to go to my special little movement place to engage in like 1 hour of special little movement versus like, to clean your house
Yes.
is a form of movement, right? Or to like go on a walk around your neighborhood and like see your neighbors is a form of movement. Like, it's important to recognize like all of the ways in which a person is moving their body that does not specifically look like this like outside of my life
Mm,
wearing this like really specific kind of set of clothes in this place that I'm paying to be at is the only form of movement, you
mm.
know.
Absolutely. Yes, 100%. I think it can be so healing to explore other forms of movement if there has been like a challenged relationship with it, right? If it's like, I've done this form of movement in order to do this with my body or make my body do this. And
Mm.
yeah, I think it can be so healing to be like, oh, wow, movement looks completely different now. And it feels completely different because my motives are so different versus this like specific
Totally.
goal.
Yeah. Yeah. Lots of conversations we can have about movement.
Yeah. And again, this is why it's so helpful to work with a dietitian because these experiences are so individualized, right? And so let's explore what is your relationship with movement and what do you want it to look like?
Yeah,
So,
totally.
yeah,
Um,
that brings us to principle number 10. So, the final principle is honor your health gentle nutrition. Um, Another one, it's like we could go in so many different directions and yeah, the idea behind this is that there may be nutrition recommendations or things that we can like add and play around with that can feel very nourishing to the body. Just for example, just like structured meals and snacks, and that doesn't mean like on the dot at this time I have to eat, but just having kind of a general understanding of like, okay, it I feel really good when I eat consistently throughout the day. And so that's a form of gentle nutrition. And I think ultimately, like, I view gentle nutrition as being sprinkled in throughout all of the principles, right? When it's like
totally.
we're rejecting diet culture and when we're honoring our bodies and listening to hunger and fullness and just all of it, it's like those are forms of gentle nutrition. And so it's not gentle nutrition isn't just, oh, am I eating X, Y, and Z foods? It's are my body's needs being met ultimately?
Totally. Yeah. I think gentle nutrition can feel also a little bit sticky for people sometimes just because um, it is a little bit more about like the like nuances of like how you feed yourself, right? And so an example sometimes I'll use with people about like gentle nutrition is if a person maybe like experiences, if we know that a person is eating enough and there's no other kind of concerns going on that might be leading to this symptom, like if someone is experiencing a lot of like constipation, right? It's like, yeah, we might need to look at like, is there anything in like your intake that like we could be changing? Is it fiber? Is it hydration? Is it like these things where it's like these are gentle ways of supporting your body operating in a way that like feels good to you? And we might be looking a little bit more specifically at things that are impacting your body currently, right?
Yep. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. And it goes for all of the food groups too, which is so important where it's like, another example I use a lot is, if clients are starting to explore movement, I'm like, how are we nourishing before and after, right? To make sure that
totally.
you have the nutrition that your body needs in order to support the whatever form of movement you
Totally.
are exploring at this point in time.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Well, yeah, I feel like there's so much we could have gone into in each of the principles, beyond what we already talked about today. But um, I think that's like maybe a good place to wrap up for now. And obviously, like people can always like talk to their individual providers, or if we get a lot of questions, we can always make another video about this kind of thing. Something I do really like to just point out whenever I like wrap up talking about intuitive eating is the fact that like there are 10 principles, and that doesn't mean that this is like a check box system, right? Where it's like, okay, I've checked off box number one, time to go into box number two. I do think the principles increase a little bit in um we've used the word nuance a lot today, so I'll use it again, but like the principles do increase in like nuance a little bit. So I do think there are like some of the earlier principles help prepare you for some of the later
Yep.
principles. And that doesn't mean that like we might not be working on like rejecting diet culture, even when we've gotten to a point where we're addressing kind of like other aspects of this. So this is like just like recovery from an eating disorder is not linear. Going through the principles of intuitive eating is not a linear process, you know?
Yes, totally. That is such a good reminder. It's like we're going to explore probably all of the principles at all times through the process.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that pretty much covers it. Again, like if anyone has questions, we probably could have talked for 4 more hours. So
Seriously.
yeah, thank you so much for everyone who tuned in and like, share, comment, all of that good stuff. And we'll have more videos to come. But Anna, it was so great to just chat with you a little bit.
Likewise. All right. Well, bye everyone.